It is the nervous system of the modern world. For a century, Canadian copper, steel, and aluminum have flowed south, forming the very skeleton of American industry, a relationship built not just on trade, but on an unshakable, shared foundation. Then, in a single move, that foundation was shattered. Trump unleashed a blitz of tariffs, linking them not to trade, but to crime. But he miscalculated. The quiet neighbor to the north didn't just retaliate, it counterattacked with a politically brilliant move that left the White House furious. How did a trade gamble backfire so spectacularly? To understand the rupture, you must first appreciate the bond. For decades, the U.S. and Canadian economies weren't just intertwined, they were fused. Under frameworks like the Ottawa Pact and later NAFTA, they created the most integrated cross-border supply chain on Earth. A single truck carrying raw materials or finished goods might cross the undefended border multiple times a day without a second thought. This wasn't just a partnership, it was a single continental economic organism, a model of efficiency and trust. Metals like copper, steel, and aluminum were the lifeblood, flowing seamlessly from Canadian mines and smelters to American factories. It was a quiet, predictable, and profoundly profitable relationship that both nations took for granted. But the first cracks in this foundation appeared during Trump's first term. The 2018 tariffs on steel and aluminum, also justified under the guise of national security, were a profound shock to Ottawa. Although a deal was eventually reached, the episode served as a painful lesson for Canada. The era of predictability was over. The United States, under this new leadership, was willing to weaponize trade and treat its closest ally as an economic adversary to achieve its goals. Canadian policymakers realized that their deep reliance on the U.S. market was a critical vulnerability. This wasn't just a trade dispute, it was a breach of trust. That experience hardened Ottawa's resolve. They began to strategize, preparing for the next inevitable confrontation. They learned that simply absorbing the blow wasn't an option. When the next, even more aggressive attack came, they wouldn't just be ready to respond, they would be ready to inflict targeted political pain. The all-out assault came in the summer of 2025. It was a deliberate 1-2 punch designed to bring Canada to its knees. First, the White House announced a staggering 50% tariff on imported copper, effective August 1st. The justification was vague, targeting what it called hostile trade partners, a list on which Canada suddenly and shockingly found itself alongside Brazil. This move alone sent tremors through industries from construction to electronics, which rely heavily on Canadian copper. But it was the second punch that revealed the true nature of Trump's gambit. He followed up with an even broader threat, a 35% tariff on all goods from Canada. And the reason given had nothing to do with trade. In an unprecedented diplomatic escalation, the White House explicitly linked the tariff to an internal Canadian issue, demanding that Ottawa do more to control the flow of illegal drugs. This was the weaponization of trade policy taken to an extreme. Tariffs were no longer tools to protect industry. They were a cudgel to be used for any and all political grievances. The strategy, as seen from the White House, was a classic Trump power play. By applying overwhelming and unpredictable economic pressure, he believed he could force a foreign government to bend to his will on a completely unrelated matter. It was intended to demonstrate ultimate leverage, to show that the U.S. could dictate terms to its closest neighbors. The message was unambiguous. We can and will crash your economy if you do not do as we say. The administration expected Canada to protest, to perhaps make some minor retaliatory gestures, but ultimately to capitulate under the sheer weight of the economic threat. They assumed the historical role of the quiet, compliant northern neighbor would hold. They fundamentally misread the room. This approach sent a chill through the markets, with the S&P 500 and commodity prices dipping on the news. But the real target was political. The Trump administration was gambling that the economic pain would be so severe and so swift that the Canadian government would have no choice but to offer concessions, not just on trade, but on policing and foreign policy. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy aimed at forcing a complete realignment of the U.S.-Canada relationship, placing Washington firmly in the driver's seat. What they failed to anticipate was that Canada had spent the last several years preparing for exactly this kind of fight, and they had developed a new playbook of their own, one that targeted Trump's own political vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Canada's response was swift, multi-layered, and far more sophisticated than Washington had anticipated. It was a strategic masterclass in counterpunching. The first move was defensive. To shield its own vital industries from being flooded by cheap global metals now locked out of the U.S., Canada immediately imposed tariff rate quotas on steel and aluminum imports from countries outside the USMCA. Any shipment exceeding the quota would face a punishing 50% tariff. This ring-fenced their domestic market, preventing it from becoming a dumping ground. The second move was proactive. The government announced a $1 billion Canadian investment fund to bolster its steel industry and support workers, signaling that it was prepared for a long fight and would invest in its own resilience rather than wait for American mercy. But it was the third move that constituted a stroke of political genius and reportedly left Trump furious. This was the offensive. Instead of a blanket retaliation that would hurt consumers on both sides of the border, Canada curated a list of American products for retaliatory tariffs that was designed not for maximum economic damage, but for maximum political pain. They called it the Red State Strategy. The list targeted iconic goods produced in states that formed the core of Trump's political base. It was a direct attack on his voters. A farmer in Iowa, a distillery worker in Kentucky, or a factory worker in Ohio would now feel the direct consequences of their president's trade war. This move brilliantly shifted the battleground. It was no longer a state-to-state dispute between Washington and Ottawa. It was a conflict that pitted the White House against its own supporters. Furthermore, Canada signaled its intent to fight on the legal front, preparing another challenge at the World Trade Organization, WTO, a slow but internationally recognized process that would brand the U.S. tariffs as illegal. This combination of defensive industrial policy, proactive domestic investment, and a surgically precise political counterattack showed a level of strategic thinking that caught the Trump administration completely off guard. Canada refused to be a passive victim. It transformed itself into an active and intelligent adversary, using its deep understanding of American politics as a weapon. This bold response created an immediate and intense stalemate. President Trump was reportedly enraged, not just because Canada fought back, but because of how it fought back. The Red State Strategy was seen as a particularly sharp political blow, one that could create genuine domestic pressure on him to reverse course. He was now in a trap of his own making. If he escalated further, he risked hurting his own voters even more, potentially jeopardizing his political standing. But if he backed down, he would suffer a humiliating public defeat, proving that his strongman tactics could be successfully defied. For Canada, the situation was equally perilous. They had stood up to a bully, but they were now in an open economic conflict with their largest and most powerful trading partner. While the WTO provided a legal avenue, it was a slow-moving process. The August 1st deadline for the crippling 50% copper tariff was ticking ever closer. Both leaders were locked in a high-stakes standoff with no easy off-ramp, and the integrated North American economy was caught in the crossfire. While Canada's political strategy was celebrated as a stroke of brilliance, the economic reality on the ground was one of profound anxiety. In industrial hubs like Hamilton, Ontario, Canada's Steel City, the tariffs created immediate chaos. For a steel fabrication company that relies on both exporting finished products to the U.S. and competing with global imports, the situation became a nightmare of uncertainty. The government's $1 billion Canadian dollar fund was a welcome safety net, but it couldn't erase the daily volatility. Major capital investment projects were put on hold. Why would a company spend millions on a new furnace or rolling mill when its primary market could be shut down at a moment's notice by a tweet? The price of commodities like copper and gold fluctuated, making long-term planning impossible. The biggest cost was the erosion of trust. A business relationship that had been as reliable as a handshake for 50 years was now governed by political brinkmanship. For the thousands of workers in these industries, the news wasn't about clever political tactics. It was about the fear of layoffs. It was about wondering if their job, their mortgage, and their family's future were secure. Canada's response may have been necessary for its sovereignty, but it came at the price of stability, forcing its most critical industries to navigate a treacherous new landscape defined by conflict rather than cooperation. On the American side of the border, the blowback from Trump's gamble was swift and severe. The policy designed to project strength ended up inflicting self-inflicted wounds. Look no further than Alcoa, a giant of American industry. The turmoil in the metals market hit them directly. The company reported staggering losses, a reported $115 million in the second quarter, with another $90 million loss projected for the third. Their analysis showed that the price of aluminum would need to hit 75 cents a pound just to break even on the tariffs, a level far from the current reality of 67 to 68 cents. This wasn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It meant immense pressure on the company, threatening jobs and future investments in the very industrial heartland Trump claimed to be protecting. The pain rippled outwards. A home builder in a red state now faced higher prices for Canadian copper pipes and steel beams, squeezing their margins and making new homes more expensive for American families. An RV manufacturer in Indiana saw the cost of its primary components, aluminum siding and copper wiring, skyrocket, making its products less competitive. The policy had backfired completely. It failed to coerce Canada and instead acted as a direct tax on American businesses and consumers, disproportionately hurting the very voters in the states it was supposed to benefit. And so, North America stands at a crossroads it never anticipated. A relationship once defined by mutual prosperity is now locked in a cycle of retaliation and political maneuvering. The United States, attempting to use its economic might as a weapon, found it turned back against its own people. Canada, pushed into a corner, discovered a new, sharper form of statecraft, but at the cost of the stable partnership its economy was built on. The trust has been broken, perhaps irreparably. The continent's integrated economic engine is sputtering, caught in a conflict with no clear victor. In the race to define the future, will North America win together, or will both sides lose trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.